When it comes to my theological opinions, I always think that I'm right. Is that bad? Is the title of this video just clickbait? Well, let's talk about it. So, hello everybody, and welcome to Grace Nerd. My name is Eric, if you're new to the channel. If you like theological conversation, or commentary on culture from a Christian worldview, or conversation about the Christian life, then make sure that you leave a like and subscribe so that you know when new uploads happen. Or if you're not watching on YouTube and you're listening to the podcast, then make sure that you follow over there. So over the course of church history, it's become clear that there are certain topics that Christians pretty much agree are secondary issues, and then there are topics that Christians believe are primary to the Christian faith, truths that all Christians must agree on in order to be saved, in order to even be considered Christians. So you'll notice probably if you've been following the channel that in recent episodes, I've touched on a lot of secondary issues. I've talked about things like Calvinism versus Arminianism, and I've talked about things like various end times perspectives. As a result of this, I've had some decent conversations with friends or people who are listening, and we've talked about ways that they disagree or agree or are still pondering some of the things that I've said, and it's led to a lot of really great conversations. This is an aspect of doing a podcast like this that I really do enjoy. However, throughout the course of addressing topics that are not central to the Christian faith, but remain controversial and remain topics of debate and conversation, a really difficult dilemma and question comes up. How certain should a Christian be about their opinion concerning a secondary theological issue? When one of these topics comes up in conversations between Christians, I tend to see Christians go in one of two different directions. Either one, they sort of dig their heels into their opinion, and they find it really difficult to get along with Christians who disagree with them, even on secondary issues. On the other hand, a Christian might become really uncomfortable with the idea of addressing a disagreement at all, and they'll basically evade the topic, and they might end up saying things like, this is a topic that we're just never going to solve. They basically begin to talk about the impossibility of drawing a conclusion when it's a topic that Christians have consistently disagreed about throughout the course of history. This is understandable, particularly because not every Christian has the time to chase down every controversial theological topic until they have the information that they want to draw a conclusion. And while I relate to this, and while there are many theological topics that I haven't reached a conclusion about yet, when people begin to speak this way, it is almost as if they are universalizing their own limitations. It's as if they're saying if they can't come to a conclusion over a given topic, then no one should be able to. If they can't draw a conclusion on the issue, then it would be arrogant for anyone else to say that they have. There's one common tactic that I've seen people use in order to back away from conversations in this way. I've at many times had friendly conversations, even debates with Christians about different issues where we disagree a little bit. And after I have basically laid out a few arguments about why I believe what I do, they begin to say something to the effect of, look, Christians and good men and women of God have debated this issue for hundreds of years, so I really don't think we're ever going to figure it out. And that basically just ends up being where they land, and the conversation really doesn't progress beyond that. So what is it about this particular comeback and the way that it's worded that kind of irks me a little bit? I think that I can honestly say that it's not so much that people don't come to agree with me. Honestly, if they just said something like, well, those are some interesting points, but I'm really not ready to jump on your side of this yet. I think it would even be fine if they said, you know what, I really don't think I'm ever going to agree with you on this. I'm just not convinced by your arguments. While that would be a little disappointing, it honestly wouldn't be offensive. I think that what bothers me about when people talk about the historical disagreement that has surrounded a particular theological topic justifying our uncertainty today is that this particular observation could be used to undermine pretty much any doctrine of the Christian faith, even primary ones. If you think about it, pretty much every issue you can think about, particularly secondary ones, have had multiple sides throughout the course of church history. But the thing is, even primary doctrines, like, for instance, the deity of Christ, has had times in church history where it was actually in the minority view. And faithful and brave men like Athanasius had to stick to the scriptures and rigorously argue for the truth until it again regained the majority view in the church. My point here isn't to say that we should suddenly begin to take all secondary issues and begin to treat them as if they are as important as primary issues. My point is simply to say that seeing that a particular issue still has controversy surrounding it, or noticing that it has for a long time, does not necessarily in and of itself say anything about the clarity of the issue in Scripture. Does this mean that all issues are just as easy to figure out in Scripture? Well, of course not. I think there is a reason why secondary issues have remained secondary issues throughout church history. But again, the mere presence of disagreement does not necessarily say anything about how clear or unclear Scripture is. For instance, sometimes Scripture is crystal clear, but we have a resistant heart, and so we kind of throw dust in the air and create confusion because we don't want to embrace what the Scripture is clearly saying. But on the other hand, there are issues where it takes a little bit more work just to see clearly what Scripture is saying. It takes multiple eyes and conversation between Christians. But seeing where the disagreement is stemming from in that spectrum is actually a part of the theological learning process. And ditching the possibility of confidence just because we're seeing disagreement existing effectively ends the pursuit of truth before it even begins. So what is the solution to this dilemma? I actually think the solution is a little bit counterintuitive, particularly in a very PC culture where it's pretty much anathema to believe that you have the market cornered on truth in any specific sense. And this brings us back to my statement at the beginning of the video and what I think will be the video title. I think that in a sense, it is actually always important to state an opinion you have as if you are sure that you are right. You should do this when you present your opinions, and you should do this when you attack another person's opinion. Actually, I should reword that. What I actually mean by this is that this is something that you already do, whether you want to admit it or not. And it's true no matter how humble you want to look. It's kind of funny. There have been times when I've tried to communicate something that I believe and someone has gotten offended by it. And, maybe they had a good reason. And maybe I wasn't charitable. Maybe I was condescending. Maybe I was unkind or something like this. But oftentimes, rather than someone pointing out that they thought that this was the issue, what they end up saying is something more like, what really bothers me is that you really seem to think that you're right. And what I find to be very ironic about this is that when they state this, they definitely seem to think that they're right by pointing it out. And they seem to be very confident that they should communicate it to me. Again, it's not just that we should communicate that we think we're right, it's that we already do this. And to say otherwise is simply self-contradictory, and I think it's false humility. In all honesty, when someone begins a statement with something like, you know what, I'm probably wrong about this, but I really want you to hear me out, I immediately begin to suspect that they're going to say something somewhat manipulative. I think that ultimately they want to convince me or other people about something, but they don't want to do it in a way that's going to invite any kind of criticism or critique. And I think that people do this because they know that when you perceive someone else as being very humble when they present an opinion, you're far less inclined to jump on them with critique or criticism. Again, I think counterintuitively, it actually takes a certain kind of courage and maybe even an odd form of humility to state something in a strong enough way that it actually invites criticism and opens you up to uncomfortable critique. Now, some of you might be hearing this and you're saying something like, yeah, but I have things that I want to say and I'm really not certain about them. There's a lot of things I want to talk about but not be dogmatic about. And that's not necessarily the situation I'm talking about. If you have an opinion you're still developing or a topic you want to talk about that you have no opinion on yet, then go ahead and present it that way and state it as a question. Again, that's not the kind of situation I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are people who are wanting to talk about an issue, in this instance, a theological issue, where they've studied the topic, they really have come to an opinion that they feel relatively certain about, but they've been sort of shamed into presenting a form of false humility where they can't really state things in a way where they sound as certain as they actually are. So, what is the balanced way to do this where you don't actually behave in an arrogant way? Much of my thought process on this actually stems from a quote that I heard from an author and pastor named Doug Wilson in a book he wrote called The Serrated Edge. So I'm going to go ahead and read that quote so you get an idea of what I'm saying here. At one point in the book, he says, "I always believe that I am right. This is not the same thing as believing that I am always right. I know that I have often been wrong. Nevertheless, I, along with everyone else in the world, always believe, at the time the view is maintained, that I am right. No one ever said that he was convinced that thus and such was the case, but that he was not convinced that it was the case. So when someone comes to rebuke me for always thinking I'm right, is he coming with this rebuke because he thinks he is wrong about it? The problem of arrogance arises whenever we refuse to bring our views to the bar of Scripture to be corrected there. And if we are willing to be corrected there, it does not matter what the world thinks about it. So again, the key point here is you will always believe that you're right, but there's a very subtle but crucial difference between that and believing that you're always right. In other words, you're going to always enter into the conversation where you are presenting your opinions in a strong way with the belief that that opinion is right, by definition. But that's different from, in an objective, universal sense, believing that you are infallible. You can always look back at your life and see times that you've changed your mind, or you can enter the conversation open to new information, but you're not going to enter a conversation presenting an opinion while thinking that you're wrong, or probably wrong. That's ultimately just going to be an attempt to score false humility points. We must always insist that we are fallible, but everyone always believes their opinion's right, otherwise it would not be their opinion. And again, one of the interesting results of this, even though it's counterintuitive, is that I find that having this kind of mindset, even in the midst of people that I disagree with, actually, in a strange way, causes me to feel like I have even greater unity with them. It's interesting. When I talk to someone from, for instance, another denomination who perhaps has different opinions on the doctrine of baptism or Calvinism versus Arminianism or whatever, if they have a settled opinion on it and we have a robust discussion about it, if they show me throughout the course of that discussion that they are truly settled on their beliefs and we still leave the conversation disagreeing, I almost seem to have even greater confidence because our disagreements are so settled. I can also believe that our agreements are also going to be very settled. We're going to have a much more close-knit unity on primary issues in the Christian faith because what's demonstrated by that discussion is both of our abilities to truly believe in something. And it's strange when I run into someone else who doesn't seem to be very settled on a lot of issues and almost takes a principled stance of not being settled on issues. I actually begin to almost unintentionally begin to feel more and more divided from them the more that we talk. Perhaps this is because of different experiences I've had watching different Christian leaders walk into different heresies, but I begin to suspect in these situations that perhaps these leaders don't have opinions where they really should on primary issues, or perhaps they're beginning to hide different opinions that they actually don't want other people to know about. Because again, while people may speak in a supposedly humble way, everyone actually does tend to have an opinion on things that they talk about, even if they cloak it in sort of an appearance of uncertainty in order to, again, look humble. And I think we actually do see this sort of thinking from the Apostle Paul, particularly when he writes in the book of Romans. Let me read a short passage from Romans 14 where Paul talks about Christians disagreeing on certain issues. In Romans 14, starting in verse 2, Paul writes, "One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand." I'll read a little bit more in just a second, but from these first few verses, you would think that Paul would basically say, as he said, don't judge one another on these issues, and you would think his next statement would be, look, these are secondary issues, therefore hold your opinions sort of with a loose hand here, but that's not exactly what he says. He goes on to say, "One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind." Now that's interesting because, again, he's talking about issues where Christians can disagree and where they shouldn't judge each other, but then he says, let each one be fully convinced. And maybe it's because he was thinking along similar lines as what I'm trying to explain right here. Maybe he realized that it would be better if we are fully convinced and walk confidently in our beliefs until perhaps, good arguments change our minds. And maybe he said this so that Christians would have confidence, again, in one another, that while they have strong, robust disagreements on secondary issues, this will demonstrate that they will have strong, robust agreement on primary issues. And I think often there is a danger that if we begin to see something as a secondary issue, as we often should, we will begin to take the idea of something being secondary as something being unimportant. So again, I've talked about issues on this channel that are secondary, where Christians are allowed to disagree. But I definitely still find them important, and that's why I talk about them. Just because they don't immediately relate to your salvation doesn't mean that they don't impact your Christian life and impact your outlook and impact your joy. I talk about secondary issues with strong conviction because they've brought joy to me when I've come to a conclusion, and I want the same for you. So there you have at least some of my thoughts on this particular issue. It's something I've thought a lot about and have kind of been forced to think a lot about as I've tackled controversies and thought a lot of these things through for myself. So if you have some thoughts on this issue, make sure that you comment below. If you found the video helpful, then make sure that you leave a like. If you have some disagreements, again, comment on that as well. I'd love to get into some discussion about it. That applies to all of you, again, who are watching on YouTube anyways. If you're listening, again, make sure you follow the podcast. And make sure you leave a review if you have been following for a while and want to leave your thoughts and let me know what you think. Again, this is Grace Nerd. My name is Eric, and I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and we will see you around in the next one.